Put a blog up earlier, some interesting videos, a couple of pictures, too. Go take a look at it if you want to. Very random, very weird videos, but just may be the nice little antidote for the conversation tonight. If it should get testy later on, and I'm hoping it doesn't, the book is Jesus Interrupted, Revealing the Hidden Contradictions in the Bible. We'll do exactly that coming up in just a minute, and then we'll talk more with Dr. Bart Ehrman about some of the classic Gnostic texts that were not included in the canon of the Bible as we know it for Christians today anyway, maybe even some of the non-canonical Jewish texts for that matter, and what should have been included or what could very well have been included. And then I think on the other side of the coin, for a lot of people out there who think that they would rather be a Gnostic, we'll explore some of the complications of that theory when you actually get to know the material there next on Coast to Coast AM. This is Ian Punnet. Bart Ehrman, a professor at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Are you a fan of the team, by the way? Was that a big deal for you to win?
Oh, a huge deal. Yeah, okay. Yeah. I have season tickets, and it's great stuff down here.
So you've turned your back on the Princeton Tigers, then? Have you?
Yeah, not a lot to root for there, but yeah. But down here, basketball is the religion of choice.
Yeah, I totally understand that. So in a way, you can stand by and you can be a part of that other church and hold hands with everybody else down there as they worship the Tar Heels.
Well, somebody should write an essay on how much like a religion basketball is. I mean, you get the fervor and the excitement and the worship of these demigods, and you get rituals and you get sacred places, and so it's all it is a religion.
And every time that UNC loses to Duke, people believe there is no God.
Well, they are the Blue Devils.
Right. So that's what happens. Somehow there's no God for a period of time.
Exactly.
And then UNC wins again, and God has been restored to God's heaven.
Yes.
So, all right, so Bart Ehrman, let's talk about some of the specific examples of some of the things, some of the ones that you get the most pushback for, whether it was from the book Misquoting Jesus or here in Jesus Interrupted, that are inconsistencies that may not get the headlines out in mainstream culture, but within the church, people have known for a long time.
Well, what I do in the book is show both kind of contradictions in details that you get, for example, between the Gospels, and then larger perspectives that are quite different from one Gospel to the other. And I think both things are very important. I mean, just as an example of what strikes me as just a flat-out contradiction. The question about when Jesus died, you would think there'd be an easy answer to what day Jesus died on, and as it turns out, two of our Gospels give us an explicit dating. Our earliest Gospel, Mark, says that Jesus had a Passover meal with his disciples, after which that was the Last Supper, after which he was arrested, and he spent the night in jail, and the next morning at 9 o'clock in the morning, he was crucified. So he was crucified the day after the Passover meal was eaten. The Gospel of John, our last Gospel to be written, also explicitly dates the event. Jesus has a meal, but it's not called a Passover meal in John. He's arrested after the meal, spends the night in jail. The next day, he gets condemned to death. After noon on, we're told, the day of preparation for the Passover, meaning that he dies on the day when they were preparing for the Passover meal. So in John's Gospel, he dies the day before the meal is eaten, as opposed to the Gospel of Mark, where he dies the day after the meal is eaten. Both Gospels are quite explicit about it, and they contradict each other, since obviously he didn't die on two different days. He died on only one. So,
right.
So that some people would think, well, that's just a minor detail. The point is he got crucified. But both John and Mark are trying to make a point in their dating of the events, and if you pretend that there's no difference between them, then you miss the point. And so that's what I argue in the book, is that to understand John, for example, you have to understand why he wants to date the death the way he does.
Well, and that gets into a very interesting discussion, to me anyway, about the community of John followers that are responsible for that gospel text, and what was different about that community that's reflected in the difference in the dating of the gospel.
Exactly. So, John is the only gospel that states that Jesus is the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. This is stated in the very first chapter of the Gospel of John twice. For John, this is a way of understanding Jesus, is that he's like the Passover lamb who gets sacrificed to bring about salvation. And so what's happened is John has changed the date that Jesus dies in order to show graphically that Jesus really is the Passover lamb, because on the day of preparation for the Passover, when Jesus is killed, is when the Passover lambs are being killed in the temple. And so John has changed the historical datum to make a theological point that Jesus really is the Lamb of God. And so this community is one that worships Jesus as the one whose sacrifice brought about salvation, like the Passover lamb.
And that also reflects the fact that that community that is responsible for the Gospel of John has been sort of rejected by this point. This is several generations after the crucifixion of Jesus, and they are no longer like the community of Mark, or perhaps even the community of Matthew, where they were still part of a Jewish community. They were just a group of worshipers of Jesus within that Jewish community. By this point, they've been totally rejected.
Yeah, there are hints within the text of John that this community of Christians started out worshiping in the Jewish synagogue as Jews, but they were kicked out of the synagogue. And they had to form their own community. And so apart from the synagogue, they started developing their own theological views. So that's one of the reasons John is so different from Matthew, Mark, and Luke. It's a separate community at a later time that started out as Jews who had been excluded from their Jewish religion, and as a result, they developed a rather anti-Jewish view of religion and a different view of Jesus.
And that's the part that I quote you on tomorrow in my sermon. And I think it's important to know that about these texts, but I don't expect to have any pushback from it at all on that. But maybe I'll let you know if there is. But
in your congregation,
yeah. But I think what's really cool about this is that you anchor this not in a sense of, you're so foolish if you believe this, but rather just kind of a very sober kind of look. If we're going to take the texts seriously, then there's no taking it halfway seriously. You can't take it seriously up until the point where it makes us uncomfortable. Taking something seriously and really devoting ourselves to it means accepting the good parts with the bad. It's like taking, loving your family, even with the crazy uncle that comes along with it, right? Or the aunt that can't remember what your name is.
Well, you can't really love your crazy uncle if you pretend that he's the same person as your father.
Exactly.
They're different people, and you have to appreciate them for what they are. And it's like that with Mark and John. I mean, if you try and reconcile these two accounts, then what you're in effect doing is you're making both accounts different, and so you're no longer respecting them for what they are.
That's what I believe, and I just think that that's the only way to really treat the Bible as in honor of what it really is, instead of just trying to make it be what we want it to be. But okay, so I love that. I mean, and that's a very good example of some of the contradictions. Some of the ramifications of that are pretty big, though, because you could make an argument that the Gospel of John is very anti-Semitic. You mentioned anti-Jewishness in there, but that turns into, and it's often been used as, the basis of some pretty harsh treatment for Jews.
Yeah, John. All of the Gospels none of the Gospels portray Jews, non-Christian Jews, in a very favorable light. But John, I think, probably goes the furthest. In John's Gospel, the enemies of Jesus are called the Jews, as if Jesus himself weren't a Jew.
Right.
But it's the Jews who are the problem. And at one point in John's Gospel, in chapter 8, Jesus says that the Jews are, in fact, children not of God, but children of the devil,
right.
children of Satan. Well, that's pretty extreme, I think.
Right. I think that's where so much of the later ugliness will come from on that. And I think that's unfortunate. And I think a lot